The ironwood hall of Duskara had never held so many wolves at once. Mireia pressed herself into the shadows of the upper gallery, her fingers curled tight around the iron balustrade, her breath coming in shallow and careful pulls as she watched the ceremony take shape below. 1,000 candles blazed in the great crown chandeliers overhead, their light cascading across the upturned faces of pack lords, elder wolves, and low-born commoners who had traveled from every distant reach of the realm to witness this single hour, the bonding rite. She should not have come. Every nerve in her body had been screaming at her to stay in the lower kitchens, where she had kept herself hidden for 4 days, waiting for Kaelin to send word as he had promised. He had looked her in the eyes 3 nights before this ceremony, his hands warm against her face, and told her that when the council's performance was finished and the political theater had satisfied those who demanded it, he would step forward and name her before all of Duskara as the woman his wolf had chosen. She had believed him, completely, without reservation, and so she had waited while the days passed and no word came. When the celebration bells of the great hall began to toll through the castle corridors, she had pulled her hood low over her face, climbed the servants' stair to the upper gallery, and told herself she only needed to see, only needed to understand. Below, on the ceremonial dais that rose above the crowd like an altar carved from the kingdom's oldest ambitions, the Alpha King of Duskara stood with his shoulders squared and his hands clasped behind his back. Even from this height she could read his frame as easily as a page she had memorized. She knew the particular tension he carried when he was containing something powerful beneath the surface. She knew how his jaw tightened when he was angry and choosing not to show it. She knew the precise angle at which he tilted his head when something troubled him deeply. She had spent 2 years learning every version of him. She knew the low, rough quality his voice took on when he spoke her name in the quiet. She knew the warmth of his hands in winter and the sound of his breathing when he finally let himself rest. She knew the expression on his face when he looked at her without his rank between them, when he was simply Kaelin and she was simply Mireia, and the impossible distance between an Alpha King and a pack less Omega felt, for a little while, like something that could be crossed. She had believed it could be crossed. That was the part she would never completely forgive herself for. "The candidates will now ascend," the High Elder announced, his voice rolling across the hushed hall with the weight of ceremony behind every syllable. Mireia's fingers pressed hard into the iron rail. 6 women in ceremonial ivory moved toward the dais steps, each one the daughter of a house whose name carried generations of weight in this kingdom. Each one trained and positioned and presented for precisely this occasion. And at their center, draped in silver cloth that caught every candle in the hall and held the light as though it had been made for her, walked Ryan of House Caldrath. The Caldraths controlled the eastern seaports. They commanded an army of 4,000 trained warriors and a fleet whose reach extended to kingdoms that did not share a language with Duskara. For 3 generations, that family had been building toward this hall, positioning their bloodline for the throne with the patient, unhurried precision of wolves who understood that the right moment was worth waiting for. Mireia watched Kaelin's face with everything she had. She watched for a flicker. Any trace of the man who had pressed his forehead to hers and told her that fate did not make errors. The man who had found a packless Omega sheltering in the outer forest during a border skirmish, and spent 3 full hours simply talking to her before he thought to mention who he was. His face was stone, empty, still, and utterly unreadable. Kaelin of Duskara, first sovereign and keeper of the wolf throne, the High Elder intoned. The council has spoken. The alliances have been weighed. The realm awaits your word. The silence that followed was long enough to become its own kind of cruelty. Mireia stopped breathing. The mark on the inside of her left wrist, a small crescent scar where his teeth had pressed gently against her skin on a quiet night beneath the old cedar canopy at the forest edge, began to burn. It had never burned before. not once in 2 years of carrying it. But now it blazed with sudden searing heat, and she pressed her opposite hand over it without thinking, trying to muffle the sensation before it forced a sound out of her. Kalen moved. But something was wrong even from this distance. His movements were deliberate in the wrong way, mechanical, as though each step had been calculated rather than chosen. The fluid, almost languid confidence that was as natural to him as breathing had been replaced by something hollow and stilted and deeply unlike him. His eyes, when he turned to survey the candidates, were flat. Not composed, not controlled. Flat, as water goes flat on a windless day when there is nothing beneath it moving. My choice. His voice rang across the hall, resonant and utterly empty, is Ryan of House Caldrath. The hall came apart. Cheers surged up to the rafters. Warriors stamped their boots. Pack lords embraced their neighbors and lifted their voices in celebration. Every man and woman who had wanted this political outcome was now making their satisfaction loudly known. Mireia could not hear any of it. The crescent scar erupted with pain so sharp and sudden that she pressed her hand hard to her mouth to keep from crying out. Her knees buckled. She caught herself against the railing with both hands, hanging there above the celebration while her vision grayed at the edges, and something deep in her chest made a sound she would never be able to describe. The sound of something she had trusted completely breaking along its entire length. She watched Kalen take Ryan's hand and raise it to his lips. She watched Ryan smile with the composed triumph of a woman who had never once doubted this outcome. She watched the Alpha King look at his chosen with eyes that held no warmth and no recognition and nothing at all. He did not search the gallery. He did not hesitate. He showed no awareness of the tie between them screaming through the claiming mark she wore. Mireia ran. Nothing in her memory survived the descent from the gallery intact. She remembered cold stone beneath her feet, the distant sound of celebration through the walls, and reaching the small room she had been assigned as a pack-less Omega, permitted inside the castle on the Alpha King's personal order. She remembered sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands pressed to her face, her whole body shaking without her permission. And then, in the dim quiet of that room, with the bonfires of celebration being lit beyond her window, a different kind of knowing settled over her. Her hands moved to her abdomen. She had told herself for weeks it was stress, the broken sleep, the tension of carrying a secret that could destabilize everything. She had reasoned with herself carefully, as a person reasoned when they were deeply afraid of what the truth would require. But an Omega's body did not lie to its owner the way the mind could. She had been carrying his child for nearly 2 months. The realization did not arrive as shock. It arrived as something quieter and more complete, a certainty that settled into her bones and made the magnitude of what she had just witnessed in that hall expand into something she could not begin to measure. Mireia stood. She packed only what she could carry in a single satchel, her healer's kit, a change of clothes, the small silver ring Kalen had pressed into her palm the night he told her she was his, asking her to keep it hidden until he could replace it with one the whole kingdom would recognize. She set it on the windowsill. She pulled her cloak tight and walked out through the servants' gate into the winter dark, the city's celebration burning at her back like something she was not permitted to mourn. Nothing moved in the tower windows as she crossed the yard. No voice called after her. No footsteps followed through the gate. Or so she told herself during the long months ahead, because the alternative was a grief she could not afford to feel. What she did not know, and would not know for a very long time, was that the sound following her out into the night was low and strangled and raw. The sound of a man coming awake in the middle of something terrible, reaching for what should have been there and finding only absence. By the time it faded, she was already gone. The village of Caerwyn had a way of absorbing people who arrived with nothing. Settled between the Greymere marshes and the western pine forests, Too far from any trade road to draw merchants and too small to register on the maps that pack authorities use to track population movements, Caerwyn had always been a quiet home to people who needed to disappear without explanation. The villagers did not ask questions. They extended to their newcomers the same respectful silence they would have wanted for themselves. Mireia had arrived nearly 3 years ago on a night when the frost was hard enough to crack stone. She had given her name as Wren, close enough to her own that she would answer to it without hesitation. She had said she was a widow and that her pack was gone. Both of these things felt accurate in the ways that mattered. The village elders had given her the old herbalist's cottage at the marsh edge in exchange for her healing skills, and she had made herself useful with a thoroughness that left no room for questions. She reset broken bones and brewed medicines for winter coughs, and sat with the dying through their final hours. And over time, the village had grown around her, the way living things grew around something that had decided to stay. Now it was the third autumn. Mireia stood at the edge of the marsh in the thin early morning light, watching her daughter pursue the geese that arrived at the water each day at this hour with the absolute confidence of a child who had never once been discouraged from chasing things larger than herself. The girl was 2.5 years old. She had dark curling hair and a laugh that carried across the marsh without effort, and eyes of a particular amber gold that Mireia could not look at for very long without feeling something shift with quiet weight behind her chest. Her name was Sovi. Mireia had chosen it because it carried no history and belonged to no house. It belonged entirely to this small, fierce person who had arrived in the middle of the hardest winter of Mireia's life and immediately made that winter survivable. Sovi had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and a developing sensitivity to sound and movement that went beyond what was ordinary for a child her age. A wolf's awareness beginning to stir beneath the surface of a child who could not yet name what she was. Mireia noticed it in small ways, Sovi lifting her head toward the forest seconds before a bird broke from the canopy. Sovi going still in the middle of play, attending to something in the middle distance that Mireia could not hear. Sovi preferring the edge of the marsh to the village square, gravitating toward the boundary between wild and settled the way a wolf-born child naturally would. It was beautiful, and it was painful in equal measure, and Mireia had learned to hold both without flinching. Mama. Sovi had abandoned the geese and was standing directly in front of her, peering upward with the unsettling perceptiveness of small children who have not yet learned to politely ignore what they see. Sad? Mireia crouched and pulled her daughter close. No, not today. It was not entirely true, but it was true enough for a morning in autumn with geese on the marsh and her daughter warm against her chest, and she decided that would have to be sufficient. She had told herself at the beginning that it would fade. Every account she had read of rejected mate pairings among wolf kind confirmed the same pattern. The claiming mark dissolved within weeks of separation. What had been connection became scar tissue, and the separated wolf moved forward. The old mark at her wrist had not faded. Nearly 3 years, and it sat precisely where his teeth had pressed, fine and silvered and permanent, burning on certain mornings when the wind came from the east. She had traded healing services for access to a traveling scholars collection and read everything available. Every text said the same thing. The mark disappeared. The wolf accepted the loss and continued. None of the texts explained why she sometimes woke in the deepest part of the night with the absolute, breathless certainty that something was reaching for her through the stillness. Not hunting. Reaching, with the specific desperation of something that had lost its bearings and was moving by instinct alone because all other guidance had failed it. She would lie still in those moments, her heart loud in the silence, until the sensation dissolved and she was left with nothing but the marsh sounds and Sovi's small breathing and the ordinary darkness of her ceiling. False hope was a cruelty she had almost no tolerance for. She was an Omega who had been credulous enough to believe an Alpha King when he spoke of fate and permanence. She would not compound the damage by manufacturing reasons to believe the story was continuing somewhere beyond her sight. The story was finished. She was Wren the Marsh Healer, mother of Sovi, resident of Caerwyn. Whatever she had been before did not belong to her anymore. The traders arrived from the North Road on a gray afternoon in late autumn, their cart wheels cutting deep channels into the softened ground. Caerwyn had gone quiet the way it always did when outsiders arrived, the particular stillness of a place that had learned to assess strangers before welcoming them. Smoke rose from the bakehouse chimney. The miller's wheel had stopped turning. Half a dozen villagers found reasons to be somewhere with a view of the square, occupied with tasks that required no movement and allowed for easy watching. Mireia noticed the traders from her herb garden, where she was cutting the last of the season's foxglove before the first hard frost came to take it. She noticed them with the careful peripheral attention she had developed out of necessity, the steady vigilance of someone who had learned to see everything without appearing to look at anything. Two traders, one loaded cart. Ordinary enough, but the boy running ahead of them was Pell, the miller's son, 12 years old and constitutionally incapable of keeping any piece of news to himself for longer than it took him to identify the nearest person worth telling. He was heading directly for her gate. "Mistress Wren," he called, breathless. "The traders are from Harenvast and they are saying things." Mireia set her shears down with a steadiness she was not feeling. "What things, Pell?" He grabbed her gate with both hands, color high in his cheeks. "They say the Alpha King has gone mad. Truly mad. Daskara is cracking apart. The eastern packs have gone feral, attacking livestock in the daytime. The grain stores in 3 provinces have been abandoned because the overseers fled and the king is not paying attention to grain stores. Kings have difficulties. That is not unusual. But this is the strange part," Pell continued, undeterred. "For years now, ever since the bonding rite, he has had wolves in the field across the entire realm, not tracking enemies, not investigating border threats." He lowered his voice with the gravity of a child who understood he was touching something enormous. "Searching for a woman, one single woman, and he has never stopped." The foxglove stems in Mireia's hands trembled. She steadied them. "No one knows who she is," Pell continued. "The traders say the king will not describe her publicly, only gives the order, and any wolf who brings him information about her whereabouts is rewarded beyond what most families see in a lifetime. 10,000 gold pieces, Mistress Wren. Not for finding her, just for knowing something. 10,000 gold." The number settled into Mireia's chest like a stone dropped into deep water, its weight radiating outward through everything she had carefully constructed in this marsh village. She thanked Pell with a honey cake from her kitchen and sent him on his way before the expression on her face became something she would have to explain. She stood in the garden for a long time after he had gone, the foxglove forgotten in her hands, her eyes fixed on the tree line to the east. A king might search for a former Omega lover for any number of practical reasons. To eliminate an heir claim before it could be used against him. To neutralize a complication before the Caldrath alliance was fully settled. None of that required genuine feeling. None of that contradicted what she had witnessed in the Ironwood Hall. She went inside and made the evening meal, moving through the familiar rhythms of her kitchen while Sovi sat beside the hearth and arranged her smooth marsh stones into patterns only she understood. She ate. She put her daughter to bed and sat at her small table in the lamplight and reminded herself, firmly and clearly, that this information changed nothing about the life she was living. She was Wren of Caerwyn. She had a garden and a roof and a practice that gave people in this village reasons to be grateful. Whatever was happening in Daskara was not her concern and could not be made to be her concern without cost she was not prepared to pay. She believed this almost completely. But that night, when the wind came hard and cold from the east and the cottage settled around her into silence, Mireia turned her left wrist upward and studied the crescent scar in the lamplight. It was burning tonight with a steady, rhythmic heat she had not felt in months. Regular, insistent, moving in a pattern her body recognized before her mind caught up with it. A heartbeat, not hers. She pressed her right hand over the mark until the burning softened. Then she rose and checked the latch on the front door and the shutters on both windows, as she had not done since the first frightened months after arriving. She told herself it was simply habit reasserting itself. But sometime before dawn, in the deep hours when the marsh was completely still, she got up and moved Sophie's small bed to sit directly beside her own, just in case. The knock came just before noon on the following day. 3 measured strikes, evenly spaced. Not the loose, rattling knock of a villager needing a cough remedy. This was deliberate, the knock of someone who had practiced being non-threatening and had not entirely succeeded. Mireia set Sophie in the kitchen corner with a bowl of dried berries and her stones to arrange, picked up the iron fire poker, positioned herself to the side of the door, and spoke without opening it. "State your business." A pause. Then a male voice, low and controlled. "My name is Taveth. I am First Wolf to the Alpha King of Duskara. I have been searching for you for 11 months, and I would very much appreciate the chance to speak with you rather than through a door." Mireya's hand tightened on the poker. "I know your name is not Ren," Taveth continued. "I know you arrived here in December. I know you wear a crescent mark on the inside of your left wrist, and I know you have a child who is 2.5 years old. I also know that coming to your door alone and unarmed, in a village full of people who have had years to become fond of you, is the safest approach I could have chosen. I would like the chance to prove I mean you no harm before your neighbors decide otherwise." She opened the door. The man on her threshold was older, perhaps 50 years, with a broad frame that had not softened with age and dark hair gone almost wholly silver at the temples. His traveling clothes were plain, deliberately so. His eyes were the deep gray of winter sky, and they moved, in the first 2 seconds, from her face to the bond mark at her wrist, to the small child watching from the kitchen corner with a berry halfway to her mouth. His expression, carefully composed until that moment, shifted into something she had not expected. It looked like grief. "She has his eyes," Taveth said quietly. Not a question. "Come inside," Mireia said. Quickly. She closed the door behind him and positioned herself between this stranger and her daughter. Taveth noticed and did not move further into the room, remaining near the door with his hands visible. "The king did not choose Ryan of House Caldrath," he said without preamble. Mireia said nothing. Her face said nothing. She had learned to do that. 3 days before the bonding rite, a compound was introduced into the king's evening wine. Something derived from rare herbs that suppress a wolf's connection to his instincts and to his mate bond. Within 12 hours, his wolf was completely unreachable. He had no access to his instincts, no awareness of their connection, and no memory of anything that had happened in the weeks before the ceremony. "That is not possible," Mireia said, her jaw very tight. "We thought so as well. Until the effects wore off 4 days after the rite, and he woke in a chamber he did not recognize, in a bed that was not his, with no memory of the ceremony or anything said in it." Taveth's voice was steady, but the steadiness was effortful. "The first coherent thing he said was your name. Not Ryan's. Not the crown. Your name." The word landed in the center of her chest with a precision that took her breath away. "What you saw in the Ironwood Hall was not Kaelin choosing another woman. What you saw was a man whose will had been taken from him, whose wolf had been silenced, whose bond had been broken against his knowledge and his consent." The first wolf met her eyes. "He did not reject you, Mireia. He was used. And when he came back to himself, it nearly destroyed him." The accumulated weight of those lost years moved through her like a cold current. All that time built on a single night she had been certain she understood. All of it resting on a foundation that had never been what she believed. He has not touched her, Taveth said quietly, as though he knew precisely which question she was not able to ask. Not once. Ryan of House Caldrath lives in the east wing of the palace in rooms the king has not entered since the night he regained his senses. He can find her pending investigation within a week of waking. The Caldraths have been threatening open rebellion ever since. Mireia sat down, not gracefully. Her legs simply ceased to cooperate. From the kitchen corner, Sophie held up a marsh stone in Taveth's direction, with the generosity of a child who had decided, by criteria visible only to herself, that this particular stranger was acceptable. Taveth looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled, and the grief she had seen on his face deepened into something that looked very much like resolve. "There is more," he said, "and it is not good." Taveth withdrew a folded letter from inside his coat and placed it on Mireille's table. She looked at it the way a person looked at something they were certain contained damage, taking a moment to prepare before opening it. The seal was already broken, dark wax pressed with a crest she recognized even from across the table. The serpent and anchor of House Caldrath. The message was brief. 6 lines in a formal hand that made its contents more disturbing for the care that had gone into producing them. The complication has been located in the western marsh settlements. The king grows closer to her position each week. The heir she bore represents an irreversible claim that supersedes any agreement reached through the right. She must be removed before the new moon. Ensure it is quiet. Lord Corvin Caldrath. Mireia set the letter down with hands that were wholly steady. She was aware of that steadiness as something separate from what was happening in her chest. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "One of our wolves intercepted a Caldrath courier 9 days ago on the western road." Taveth's voice was hard. This was not the first message of its kind. It was the third. The first 2 we did not intercept in time to read. We do not know how much information about your location had already been sent. Mireia thought about Pell and the traders from Harenvast, about how easily news traveled along ordinary roads in ordinary carts. "How long have the Caldraths known where I am?" "No more than 2 weeks, but Lord Corvin is not a patient man, and the new moon is in 8 days. Taveth folded the letter. "We do not know how many were sent or by what route. What we know is that they are coming." The fire in the hearth crackled. Sophie had fallen asleep against the kitchen wall with her stones arranged in a circle around her feet. Mireia looked at her daughter and felt something ancient and absolute move through her. "Why did you come alone?" she asked. "Because bringing an escort of the king's wolves into a marsh village would announce your location to every Caldrath informant between here and the capital before nightfall." Taveth paused. "The king does not know precisely where you are. I believed you deserved to hear the truth before he arrived, so that when he finds you, and he will find you, their connection has been guiding him closer with every passing day. You would not face him carrying only the version of events that drove you out of Discara." The crescent scar on her wrist had been burning steadily since the previous night. Rhythmic and close, the closest it had felt in all her years away from Discara. "He feels that," Taveth said, watching her press her hand over it. "Every pulse of what holds them together is guiding him. Every day, he gets closer." Mireia opened her mouth to respond. A sound stopped her, a soft displacement of undergrowth at the marsh edge, movement that came from 3 places simultaneously in a coordinated pattern that nothing solitary would produce. Taveth was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the blade at his hip she had correctly assumed was there. Through the window above the kitchen basin she could see the tree line at the eastern edge of the marsh. 4 wolves, coal-dark and long-limbed, standing perfectly still among the pines. Not Kaelin's pack. These were lowland wolves, their coats the deep charcoal of the Caldrath Eastern Territories, their stillness the particular stillness of predators who had already identified their target. A fifth shape moved along the left flank, a sixth on the right. They had surrounded the cottage while she and Tavith were talking. They were already here, Tavith said, his voice dropping low. Waiting for confirmation of your location. He turned to her sharply. Is there a back way out? The marsh. But they will already have it covered. He looked at Sophie asleep against the kitchen wall. His jaw tightened. Then we do not run. He pressed his long blade into Mireya's hands and moved to the front door. Hold the child close. Do not come outside until I tell you it is safe. He opened the door and stepped out into the failing afternoon light. The first howl split the air a moment later. Then the sounds of wolves meeting wolves with intent, of bodies and ground and the particular violence that happened when trained fighters had no room left for restraint. Mireya lifted Sophie from the kitchen floor. Her daughter came awake with a soft murmur and pressed her face into Mireya's neck. Mireya held her close with one arm and gripped the blade in her other hand, her eyes fixed on the window. Through the glass she could see Taveth's shifted form moving between the Caldrath wolves with the hard, efficient precision of a trained first wolf. He was holding his own. For now. The bond mark blazed with sudden heat. Kaelin was somewhere on that road. Moving. Still moving. As he had been moving for years. Because he had never once stopped. She held Sophie tighter and watched and waited. Outside, a sharp cry cut across the marsh. Then a longer silence. Then another. Then the sounds of Taveth's fight changed, from two participants to one, and then there was only one sound left, the sound of a single set of paws circling the building with slow, unhurried patience. They had taken down the first wolf. Mireya was alone. The circling stopped. In the silence that followed, Mireya became aware of how complete the stillness was. No marsh birds, no wind through the pines. Sophie had gone rigid against her shoulder with the instinctive tension of a child who had inherited a wolf's sensitivity to threat. A knock at the front door. Measured and almost courteous. Healer, a male voice said from outside. Open the door. No harm will come to the child. You have my word. Mireya was calculating. The back window to the marsh edge, the space between the first trees. Whether she could carry Sophie and still manage anything useful if they were intercepted before clearing the open ground. The numbers did not work. They had not worked since she saw the sixth wolf take the right flank. She looked down at her daughter. Sophie was staring at her with those amber eyes, completely still, not crying, not asking questions, with the focused quiet of a child who understood at some level below language that this was not the moment for noise. Mireya touched her daughter's face. Sophie leaned into the touch. Something moved in Mireya's chest. She had spent years keeping it still. Every instinct, every impulse, every thread of the ability that had first manifested when she was 7 years old and had pressed her small hands against a dying sheep in a neighbor's field and felt something flow outward from her and through it. She had locked it down and sealed it away and refused to touch it, because an Omega displaying abilities that exceeded her station was an Omega, inviting the kind of attention that ended badly. She had hidden it through 2 years of secret meetings with a king who had never known the full truth of what she was. She had hidden it through the long exile at the marsh edge, where her healing was conventional enough to be explained by knowledge of plants, and nothing more remarkable than that. She had hidden it because the world had made very clear across a long history of examples what it did with Omegas who were too much. The knock came again, stripped of patience now. Last chance. I will take the door if you do not open it. Mireya set Sophie on her feet and crouched to her daughter's eye level. Stay behind me. Do not let go of my hand. Whatever you see, do not be afraid. Do you understand? Sophie looked at her steadily. Yes, Mama. Mireya straightened, set down the blade, and opened the door. There were 4 of them in human form on the threshold, 2 others in shifted form at the edges of the frost-covered yard, their dark coats blending with the failing light. Taveth was on the ground 10 feet back, breathing but motionless, his silver-streaked hair damp against the frost-covered ground. The man at the front was tall and narrow, with the stillness of someone who controlled himself with great and constant effort. He wore no Caldrath insignia. He looked at Sovi, then at Mireia. "Lord Caldrath sends his regrets," the man said, with no regret at all. He raised his hand in a signal. The shifted wolves at the yard's edge began to move. Mireia stepped forward, placing herself between them and her daughter with both feet planted in the threshold, and she stopped holding it back. It was not a choice she made with her mind. It was a thing that happened below thought, below decision, the way a bone responds to an impact before the brain has registered the pain. Years of compression released in a single unguarded breath, and what came out was not golden healing light, not warmth, not anything so gentle as that. What came out was truth. And Omega's deepest power was not physical. It was resonant. Omegas existed in wolf hierarchy not at the bottom of a chain, but at the living center of it. The point of emotional gravity around which packs cohered. The frequency that kept wolves from tearing one another apart when tensions rose past the point of reason. A true mate, bond Omega, one whose wolf was permanently intertwined with an alpha's at the soul level. One who had spent years carrying that connection alive and unresolved in her body, feeling his grief move through the old mark every single night in the stillness, was something the texts on Omega Power had rarely encountered. When Mireia's suppressed ability broke its containment, every wolf in that frost-covered yard felt it. Not light, not fire. A wave of pure, undeniable emotional reality projected outward from her without filter or mercy. They felt what she carried, the devastation of the Ironwood Hall, the winter road she had walked alone with his child growing inside her. The 1,000 mornings of watching Sovi's amber eyes and feeling love and grief occupy the same breath. The claiming mark burning in the stillness, the searching presence she had refused to name. The moment she had read 6 lines in a formal hand and understood that the years she had lost were not the result of his choice, but of a crime committed against them both. Every wolf in the yard went to their knees, not from physical force, from the weight of what they were made to feel. The shifted wolves collapsed mid-stride, their aggressive momentum dissolving as the emotional reality of what this woman had survived crashed through every instinct they possessed. The tall man swayed. "You cannot," he managed. "A pack less Omega cannot have a connection this strong." "It is not pack less," Mireia said quietly from the doorway. She felt Sovi's small hand find the back of her knee and hold on. The tall man looked at the child, at the amber eyes that were unmistakably Kaelin's, and in his face, beneath the loosened control, she saw the precise moment he understood the full scope of what Lord Corvin Caldrath had sent him to destroy. He ran. The others followed in a ragged, graceless retreat, shifting mid-stride as they hit the tree line and vanishing without a backward look. Not the retreat of wolves completing a mission, the retreat of wolves who had felt something they had no framework for and wanted as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever had just happened. Mireia walked to where Taveth lay in the frost-hardened grass and pressed 2 fingers to his throat. His pulse was steady, his breathing slow but even. He would live. "Mama," Sophie said from beside her, looking down at Taveth with solemn attention. "Sleeping? Hurt. But he will be better." Mireia straightened and looked east, toward the road that ran all the way back to Duskara. The faint silver scar at her wrist was not just burning now. It was blazing, steady and insistent and close, the closest it had felt since the night everything broke. Not searching anymore. Arriving. Mireia did not go back inside. She stood at the edge of the open ground before her cottage with her daughter beside her and her hand over the mark, and she waited for what was coming. She was done running. The first wolf came out of the pine forest at the far edge of the marsh, then another, then three more, side by side, moving without sound through the low autumn grass at the perimeter. Then they came in their hundreds, and then their hundreds became something more than that. Mireia stood in the frost and watched them fill the tree line. Wolves of every size and coloring, silver and gray and tawny and dark, emerging from between the trees in a continuous silent tide that spread along the full length of the forest edge and kept coming. Not aggressive, not circling, simply present, the way a pack was present around the thing it had decided to protect. She had heard the title her entire life, Alpha King. She had understood it in the abstract way that lowborn Omegas understood titles that existed several worlds above their own. She understood it differently now. This was what it looked like when an Alpha King called his entire pack to him. Not his guard, not his warriors. Every wolf who had sworn loyalty to the crown of Duskara, following the pull of their alpha's bond across the long years and 300 miles of searching, because their king had been searching, and when an alpha moved with that kind of singular purpose, his pack did not stay home. They had all come. The crescent scar was no longer burning. It was singing, a high, clear resonance that moved through her bones and settled into her chest and told her, with a certainty that required no further argument, exactly where in that vast assembly to look. Kalen stepped out of the trees. He was in human form, dressed in traveling clothes that had seen many roads, moving through his wolves with the ease of a man who had been living among them for a very long time. He was looking at the cottage, then at the open ground before it, then at the woman standing in the frost at the threshold of a small marsh-edge home, years and 300 miles from the life he had destroyed without intending to. He stopped when he saw her. The entire pack went still with him. Then Sophie, who had been holding the back of Mireia's knee and watching the arriving wolves with a small child's wonder rather than fear, let go and took 3 steps forward to get a better look at the man who had just come out of the forest. The amber eyes found the amber eyes. Kalen made a sound that Mireia had never heard from him before. Not words. Not a wolf sound. Something between the two. A low, involuntary break in his breathing, as though something he had been holding at enormous cost had just snapped its restraint. He crossed the open ground in seconds and dropped to his knees in the frost-stiffened grass directly in front of Sophie. A king of Duskara on his knees before a 2.5-year-old child in a marsh village, and the 1,200 wolves watching from the tree line were utterly silent. Sophie regarded him with the focused gravity she applied to all things she considered important. Then she reached out and placed both of her small hands on either side of his face, the way she had seen her mother cup patients' faces when assessing them. Kalen closed his eyes. When he opened them and looked up and found Mireia standing above him, they were bright with tears he was not attempting to conceal. "May I?" he said, his voice barely carrying across the distance between them. "Hold her?" The question broke something in Mireia's chest. The most powerful wolf in 3 kingdoms was asking her permission to hold his own daughter. She nodded. He lifted Sophie with hands that were careful to the point of reverence. The child allowed this with the calm of someone who had assessed the situation and found it acceptable, settling against his chest and patting his jaw once with a proprietary air that was wholly her mother's. Kalen held her and shook. When he finally rose to his feet and looked at Mireia with Sophie against his chest, the full weight of what the years apart had cost him was written across every line of his face, the hollows beneath his eyes, the sharpness in his jaw. The particular exhaustion of a man who had not let himself rest because resting meant accepting that the thing he was searching for might not be found. "I did not choose her," he said. His voice was rough, as though it had been used hard for a long time and had not recovered. "Ryan, I did not choose her. I need you to know that before anything else." "I know," she said. Taveth told me. Mireia, I know what they did to you. She held his gaze, and the long years she had spent holding herself together in this marsh village were in her voice, the texture of them unmistakable. And I know you have been searching. I felt it. Through the mark. In those quiet hours. Every time it burned. I felt something looking for me, and I told myself it was not real, because allowing myself to believe it would have destroyed me. It was never not real. He moved toward her, and she did not step back. What we have between us was the only thing I had ever been certain of. When I woke from whatever they put in that wine and understood what had happened, I did not think about the council or the Caldraths or the political consequences. I thought about you. Only you. You were 4 days too late, Mireia said quietly. I know. No defense in the words, only acknowledgement, clean and absolute. I know what those 4 days cost you, what the weeks after cost you, what all of this, carried alone for so long, has cost you. And there is no apology I can offer that is proportionate to that. He reached out slowly, giving her time to refuse, and took her left hand in both of his. He turned her wrist upward and looked at the crescent scar. Then he pressed his thumb gently over it. The resonance between them surged with such force that her breath caught. Not the burning she had grown accustomed to, but something fuller. Recognition. Two halves of a frequency finally finding each other after a long and damaging separation. I loved you, she said, and the past tense was deliberate, because she needed him to understand what the time between had been. Even when I was certain you had destroyed me, I loved you in the winter I spent alone waiting to see if both of us would survive it. I loved you every morning. Sophie opened her eyes and looked at me with your face. I do not know what to do with that, Kaylin. I do not know what to do with years of loving someone I believed had discarded me. He released her wrist and pressed her hand flat against his chest, above his heart, as he had done once in a forest 2 years before any of this had happened, when he was trying to show her something he did not yet have the language for. His heartbeat was the same. That at least was the same. Tell me what you need, he said. Whatever it is. Time, distance, answers. All of it. In whatever order you require. I am not here to take you back against your will. I am here because you are my mate. Because that child is my daughter. And because I would rather stand in your marsh and beg your forgiveness for the rest of my life than spend one more day pretending I can function without you. Sophie, who had been listening from his shoulder with her fingers tangled in his collar, said with complete conviction, hungry. The sound that came out of Kaylin's chest was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and it was the most undone sound Mireia had ever heard from him. She took her daughter from his arms. She looked at the man standing in the frost with his entire kingdom of wolves at his back and all those years of grief on his face. Come inside, she said. I will put the kettle on. It was not forgiveness yet. They were both too honest for a reconciliation that moved faster than its wounds. But it was a beginning, offered and accepted, and that was enough for now. Not one of the assembled wolves moved until their king had crossed the threshold. They stayed in Caerwyn for one night. Taveth was carried inside and placed before the fire, where Mireia worked through each of his injuries with careful, practiced hands, except that this patient watched her work with the expression of a man who had spent 11 months searching for this woman and was not yet convinced she was real. While Taveth recovered enough to sit upright, Kaylin told Mireia what the separation had actually been. He told her about waking on the 4th morning after the rite in a chamber he did not recognize, with a woman he did not know sitting in a chair by the door, and the absolute blankness where his memory of the preceding 4 days should have been. The way his wolf had surged up through the fog of whatever the Caldraths had given him, and the first coherent thing that Wolf had known was not where he was or what had been done. It was their connection. The fact that it was wrong, stretched and fraying and reaching towards something already moving away. He told her about running to her chamber, about the empty room and the ring she had left on the windowsill, about the hour he had spent sitting on the floor of that room before Taveth found him, and he was able to speak again. He told her about the searching from the inside, following the thread of what held them together through every waking hour, feeling it pulse with evidence of her life and her pain and her refusal to stop moving, close enough to be real but never close enough to find. I reached for you every night, he said. They were sitting at her small table with the fire behind them and Sovie asleep in the next room, and the cottage quiet around the words. My wolf would settle enough to sleep, and I would push through what was left between us and try to tell you that I was coming, that what you had seen was not what it appeared, that the other side of the mark was not empty. I felt it, Mireia said. I thought I was inventing it. You were not. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She held still. She was not done being angry. She thought she might not be done for some time, and she thought he understood that, because he did not press for more than she offered. He simply stayed, the way someone stayed who understood that presence was its own form of answer. In the gray hours before dawn, a rider came hard and fast down the north road in a state that told Mireia, even from across the cottage, that whatever he carried was not good news. My king. The scout barely had breath to form the words. Lord Corvin struck at midnight. He had the council declare you mentally unfit to rule. He has confined the loyal wolves to the lower barracks. The castle gates are flying Caldrath colors. Ryan has been installed in the throne room. Lord Corvan is calling himself regent pending your submission to council judgment. Kaelin's eyes had gone to the flat amber of a wolf fully in control of what he was feeling, precisely because what he was feeling was enormous. The loyal wolves. How many confined? 43, my king. Pending judgment for refusing to swear to the regent. Lord Corvin's deadline is noon today. Mireia looked at Kaelin. He looked back at her with the expression of a man about to ask something he did not want to ask. Stay here, he said, with Sovie. Let me go ahead with the pack and secure the castle. When it is safe, I will send for you. No, Mireia said. Mireia. 43 loyal wolves stand trial at noon. The road takes until mid-morning, leaving almost no time. She held his gaze steadily. What ends this faster is someone walking through those gates before the pack arrives. Someone Corvan was not expecting to walk in under her own power. I will not be used as bait, she added, before he could frame it that way. I will be used as the true queen of Discara, walking into her own castle and making Lord Corvan answer for what he has done in full view of every wolf he believes is now loyal to him. A silence. Then, quietly, you are certain? I am done letting the Caldraths dictate where I am and what I do. She looked at her daughter asleep through the open door. Sovie stays here with 2 of your wolves until this is finished. She does not come to the capital until it is safe. Kaelin held her gaze, then turned to Taveth. Right ahead. Tell the pack captains the approach plan. We leave in 1 hour. He looked back at Mireia. Together, she said, before he could say it first. He nodded once, and in his face she saw something she had not seen in all the long time they had been apart. Not hope exactly. Something older and more durable. Certainty. They left Caerwyn before the sun rose. When the capital came into view with the silver serpent of House Caldrath flying from towers that had always flown the crown of Discara, something hardened in Mireia's chest with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. Kaelin's pack fanned out across the hillside in silence. 1,200 wolves. More frightening than any howl. Mireia dismounted at the gate road and walked to the castle gates alone. The Caldrath guards on the walls looked down at the single figure approaching without escort or armor or apparent concern. There was a long, confused pause before anyone thought to call out a challenge. She did not slow her pace. She reached the gates, placed both hands flat against the iron, and said in a voice that carried every ounce of the power she had stopped hiding, "Open them." The gates opened. The throne room of Discara had been arranged with the particular care of people who wanted their authority to look inevitable. Lord Corvin Caldrath sat not on the throne itself, which would have been too obvious a provocation, but in a chair positioned directly beside it, close enough to make the point without the literal act. Broad-shouldered, white-haired, with the kind of face that had been commanding rooms since before most of the people in this one were born. Ryan stood to his right in a gown the color of Caldrath silver. She looked at Mireia with an expression that moved through surprise and settled on contempt with practiced efficiency. The room held perhaps 60 wolves, Caldrath loyalists, council members who had bent to the new political wind, and a handful of senior wolves whose expressions told Mireia they were not Caldrath supporters, but were acutely aware that their 43 colleagues were locked in the lower barracks. No one had expected her to walk in. That was the first thing she had. "Mireia," Lord Corvan said slowly, as though placing a name he had expected to use in a very different context. "You are more composed than I anticipated." "And you are less prepared than I expected," she replied, "for a man who has had years to consolidate a position that was never legitimate to begin with." Something moved in the room. Not sound. A shift in the air. The atmospheric change that occurred when people in a contained space were recalculating their position. Corvin smiled. "You are brave, walking into this room alone." "I am not alone. There are 1,200 wolves on the hillside north of this castle. The gates I walked through are still open behind me. And the Alpha King of Discara is one signal from entering this room with every wolf who swore loyalty to the crown and not to your family's ambitions. The king is unwell. The council has made that determination." "The council made that determination at your instruction, in an empty session, without the presence of the wolves whose support gives this council its authority." Mireia looked around the room, making eye contact with the faces she identified as uncertain. "Every wolf in this room knows what the Caldraths did. The compound in the king's wine. The bonding rite conducted on a man whose will had been removed from him. The assassination orders sent to the western provinces when it became clear the king would not stop searching." "Careful," Corvin said, and the controlled quality was gone from his voice now. "Your regency depends on the story that Kaelin chose your daughter willingly, that he is now unwell, that the woman he has been searching for is a complication rather than the reason. The moment I stand here and speak, the story fails." She was close enough to the center of the room that every wolf present could see her clearly. She pressed her hands together, not threateningly, simply bringing her attention inward for one breath. "The truth," she said, and let go. Not the undirected release of the cottage yard. This was deliberate, focused, projected outward from the center of everything she had lived and survived, with the precision of a woman who had spent those long months learning what she was capable of. Every wolf in the room felt it, not her pain in isolation, all of it together. The full interior landscape of what the Caldrath family had manufactured when they drugged the Alpha King and sent Mireia into the winter dark with his child and his mark, and no explanation. The night she had packed her satchel by firelight, while celebration bonfires burned below the window. The road she had walked alone. The long years in the marsh. The scar that would not fade. The dreams she had forbidden herself. Every morning of Sovi's life in which this child had looked at her mother with her father's eyes and asked nothing because she did not yet know what to ask. The room went very quiet. Several council members had their eyes closed. 2 of the younger wolves were openly weeping without apparent awareness of it. The experienced warriors near the walls stood with their jaws tight and their hands still, absorbing something they had not been trained to withstand. Ryan's face had gone white. Lord Corvin alone seemed to be fighting it, his grip on the arms of his chair white-knuckled, working through what he was feeling with the focused resistance of a man who had spent a lifetime refusing to let his interior override his strategy. He was losing. "Enough," he said, and the word came out cracked along one edge. He stood and drew the long Caldrath iron sword from his hip, and the sight of it resolved something in the room. Several wolves stepped back. Several stepped forward with the instinct to intervene, then stopped themselves because their colleagues were still locked in the barracks below. He moved toward Mireia. She did not move. From the far side of the room, something small slipped through a gap in the gathered bodies. A child, dark-haired and amber-eyed, who had secreted herself inside a saddlebag for the journey from Caerwyn because the two wolves assigned to guard her had not fully appreciated how much determination could live inside 2.5 years of living. Sophie moved through the adult legs with the absolute confidence of a child who had not yet learned to fear rooms full of power, walked directly to her mother's side, and took hold of her hand. Lord Corvin stopped. He looked down at the child, at the amber eyes that were the Alpha King's in miniature, looking back up at him with a small child's complete absence of intimidation. Something happened in the Caldrath Lord's face that Mireia had not expected. A fracture. Not strategy, not recalculation. Something older. Doubt. Moving through a man who had committed crime after crime against this child's existence, and was now confronted with the undeniable fact of her in a way that the letters he had written in his study could never have prepared him for. His sword arm wavered. The room moved. Not Corvin's wolves. The others. The council wolves and the uncertain warriors who had spent an hour feeling the truth of what this woman had survived and were now watching a man level a sword at the child who was the direct product of it. The instinct that moved through them was not political. It was pack. 3 of them stepped between Lord Corvin and Mireia before the thought had fully formed, because a wolf's deepest imperative, older than allegiance and older than ambition, and older than the manufactured politics that had brought them all to this room, was the protection of the young. Lord Corvin looked at the wolves who had just stepped against him and understood that the room had changed completely and that nothing he did in the next 60 seconds would change it back. The throne room doors opened. Kaelin walked through. He crossed the room without speaking, and the Caldrath wolves parted for him. Not because they had been ordered to, but because the alternative required a conviction that was no longer in the room. He stopped beside Mireia. He looked at Sophie holding her mother's hand. Then he looked at Lord Corvin Caldrath standing with a drawn sword, and 3 of his own wolves standing against him. "I love you," Mireia said. Not to Corvin, to Kaelin standing beside her, said in the plain and clear voice of someone who had carried those words for years in a place too damaged to speak them aloud, and was now done waiting for a better moment. There was no better moment. There had never been a better moment. There was only this one, in this room, with her daughter's hand in hers and the full weight of everything they had survived between them. Kaelin turned to her. His eyes were blazing gold. "I love you," he said, "from the first moment in that forest and every moment since. I will spend the rest of my life proving it deserves to be said in a room quieter than this one." She laughed. It came out a little broken and wholly real. Lord Corvin Caldrath dropped his sword. Not from force, from the futility of a man who had staked everything on a position that the room had simply stopped supporting. He looked at his daughter, who was staring at the floor with the expression of a woman who had understood, in the past hour, that she had spent years as an instrument of her father's ambitions without ever being asked whether she wanted to be. Then Lord Corvan, regent of nothing and father of a manufactured claim, lowered himself into his chair and placed both hands on his knees. "It is done," he said. It was. The bond completion happened 3 days later on the high balcony overlooking the Capitol, not because it had been planned or scheduled, but because on the 3rd morning after the throne room, Mireia woke before dawn and lay in the quiet, listening to the claiming mark at her wrist, and it was no longer burning. It was singing. The same high, clear resonance she had felt in the marsh when the pack emerged from the trees. But quieter now, purposeful, waiting for the last step of something that had been in progress for 5 years. She found him on the balcony, standing in the pre-dawn dark with his forearms on the stone railing and his eyes on the city below. He turned when he heard her, and she knew from his expression that he had been awake for the same reason. "It is asking to be finished," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I thought it polite to wait until you were ready." She stood beside him and looked out at the sleeping city. Much had been settled in those 3 days. Lord Corvan was in the castle's holding cells pending trial. Ryan was confined to the East Tower, not in punishment, but in the complicated care extended to a woman who had been positioned as a weapon and was only now beginning to understand the full shape of what had been done to her as much as through her. The loyal wolves had been released. Most of the Caldrath loyalists had sworn true allegiance or departed. The capital was exhaling, slowly, as a place exhaled after something held wrong for a long time was finally set down. "I want to do it here," Mireia said. "Not in the throne room, not in the ironwood hall. Here, like this." "No ceremony?" Kaelin asked. "No ceremony." She turned toward him and reached up to touch the place where his neck met his shoulder, the traditional location of the claiming mark. "You gave me mine in a forest before dawn with no one watching. This is how we do things, apparently." He laughed softly and turned his head, baring his throat in the old gesture of offering, the gesture that had always meant "I choose this willingly and without reservation." She felt her wolf rise within her, answering the call of the incomplete tether between them with the sureness of something that had always known this moment was coming. Her teeth found the spot. What was between them completed like a door that had been standing open for years, finally closing from the inside. It was not painful. It was whole. The wholeness of a frequency that had been singing against silence, finally finding its answering note. The two halves of a resonance settling into each other and becoming something that would not be moved again. Through that completed connection, she felt him entirely, and he felt her. The winter road, the cottage at the edge of the world, the scar that would not fade, the mornings with Sovi. All that devoted time spent loving someone through grief and anger and the specific endurance of a woman who had decided that surviving was its own form of devotion. When Mireia drew back, they were both very still in the pre-dawn quiet. Kaelin pressed his forehead to hers, his hands holding her face with the care of someone who had spent too long without something they needed and did not intend to be careless with it now. 5 years, he said, from the forest to this balcony, all of it. All of it, she agreed. I would not unmake any of it. Even the marsh? She thought about the cottage, the geese, Sovi on the kitchen floor with her stones in their circles, the mark burning in the deep hours, the times she had pressed her hand over it and felt his heartbeat and refused to name what she was feeling. Even the marsh, she said. Sovi happened in the marsh. I happened in the marsh. What I am now, I became there. I do not want to be the version of me who never had to learn what I am capable of. Below them, as the first light of dawn began to separate the city from the sky, a single wolf howled from somewhere in the capital. Then another joined it. Then more, voice after voice, lifting from the streets and the barracks and the walls of the castle, until the sound was everywhere, rising from 1,200 wolves who felt the completion of the alpha bond move through them like a current, a frequency shifting in their chests from something strained and searching to something whole. The packs of Duskara howled their king's mate home. In the months that followed, the realm healed in the way that places healed when the thing that had been fractured was genuinely repaired rather than papered over. The eastern packs that had gone feral during the long broken period came back to themselves as the resonance of the completed tie rippled through the realm's pack structure, and the long fraying finally stopped. The grain stores were restocked. The council was restructured with wolves who had chosen their positions based on something other than which political wind was blowing hardest. Lord Corvin Caldrath stood trial before the assembled packs and was found guilty on every charge. He was exiled, House Caldrath dissolved, its political standing stripped permanently. Ryan was given a choice that had never once been offered to her before. She could remain in Duskara as a private citizen, or she could leave and build whatever life she chose beyond the realm's borders. She chose to leave. Mireia watched her go from the castle walls and felt not triumph, but something quieter, the complicated feeling of a woman who understood that Ryan had also been a victim of her father's plans, even if the shape of that victimhood looked very different from her own. The formal acknowledgement ceremony was held in the Ironwood Hall on a morning in late winter. Mireia stood on the dais in a gown the color of deep winter sky, not ivory and not silver, colors that belonged to other histories, and received the allegiance of the pack lords with Kaelin beside her and Sovi on her hip. The same hall where she had stood in the upper gallery and watched her world collapse. It looked wholly different from the dais. She had stood in the shadows of this hall and believed herself invisible, a nobody with a mark on her wrist she would carry alone for the rest of her life. The hall had not changed. The candles had not changed. The iron had not changed. She had changed. That was the only thing that needed to. That night, in the chambers that were now simply theirs, Kaelin sat on the edge of the bed, with Sovi already settled in the adjoining room and Mireia beside him. She asked me today, he said, why I was not there when she was small. Mireia went still. What did you tell her? I told her I was looking for her mother, that I had been looking for a long time and that I was very sorry it had taken so long to find her. He paused. She thought about it and told me that looking for a long time and not giving up was a good thing, and that she was not angry. Mireia closed her eyes. She is 2.5, she said. I know. His voice was warm with it. She is extraordinary. She is yours, Mireia said simply. What did you expect? Outside, the capital was quiet, settling into its restored version of itself. The claiming mark at her wrist was cool and silver and permanent, and the mark on Kaelin's throat matched it, and what lived between them now was not a burning or a searching or a question reaching through the night. It was an answer, complete, and held between them, and not going anywhere. Somewhere below, a wolf howled at the winter moon, not in grief, not in searching, simply because the night was clear and the world was whole, and the sound of a wolf's voice lifting into the dark had always been first and last an expression of joy.